about also for quantum gravity preloaded.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Emilia and Baptiste for the invitation to this workshop. I will be talking about a number of topics I know a number of people in this room are thinking about as well, which is both fortunate but also complicated because I know there's much work in progress by people in this room and associated to the group, which I was unsure about how to refer to and whether, to what extent it was okay for me to more publicly refer to it. So I've chosen a somewhat conservative line on that, even though I'm aware that there's much more work that's going on right now on some of these topics. I hope that's okay, but anybody should feel free to contribute in the discussion in the way that they see fit. I will start by approaching the topic from basically where we left it off in the paper. Vincent Lam and I left it off in the paper that was only relatively recently published, but really has been written for quite a while before then. In that paper, we tried to show, using three main approaches to laws of nature, a Humean account, and particularly a Lewisian account, dispositionalism and primitivism, in particular sort of Tim Maudlin's approach to primitivism, and how all of these, and tried to show how all of these approaches suffered in a context in which you couldn't rely on there being space-time, which is a suggestion, at least from quantum gravity. Whether or not this will turn out to be the case remains to be seen, but I think it's appropriate for philosophers to consider potential implications such an absence of space-time may have had, and the purpose of this paper is to show what the implications would be or could be for laws of nature. Okay. I mean, this, I say, inapplicable. See, it comes back. We just keep calling, it comes back. It's inapplicable, maybe is a little bit so that we cannot show, as Daniela has noticed, but saying it's inapplicable may be a little bit strong, but in the paper we showed how the revisions that would need to be undertaken are nevertheless quite radical, and because of that maybe we could say it's not exactly those approaches which survive, but somewhat modified versions of them. Now, I understand that there are other approaches than those we have covered in the paper. We had to limit us somehow. We thought we addressed at least some of the major approaches, but clearly, it was not the goal to do all of them. One important view that we have not addressed is, of course, the Tversky-Tooley-Armstrong or nomic necessitation view. There's also a sort of a follow-up on that, the essentialist VTA view, a hybrid version, non-absolutist version, which has been developed by a group of up-and-coming Genevan philosophers. And there's also other versions of power accounts related to dispositionalism, or there's sort of maybe a cluster of views, we could say, about powers and dispositionalisms. Not all of which were fully captured by our discussion in that paper. And I'm going to say something somewhat superficial about this group of approaches because arguably there's a sense in which all of them rely on something like a distinction between kinematical and dynamical possibilities, and to the extent to which such a distinction is problematic in the context of quantum gravity, to that extent, these approaches will have to be revised as well. Then there's the minimal primitivism approach by Eddie Jen and Shelley Goldstein, which is a version of a constraint approach as well, that I have not in the paper and will not today really discuss, even though I think it's something that might be potentially relevant and successful in the context of non-gravity. The one approach which is somewhat related, I'm going to talk about most, is Emily Adlam's particular version of the constraint approach. All right, there are of course more, so still we're not giving an exhaustive list here. Okay, now I hardly need to explain the difference between a Humean and a non-Humean account of laws, what the difference is. But it is important, nevertheless, to remind ourselves what the sort of the metaphysically prior or fundamental posits of an approach are, because that's what I'm going to use for classifying them, and that is something that will determine what's on what's on your to-do list. If you want to approach a particular have a particular approach, you will need to sort of start with the basis, with the fundamental, and then show how the metaphysically derivative is supposed to be following. So in a Humean version, you start as metaphysically prior the occurrent facts, something like that, the non-modal facts, and you then show how these determine the laws of nature, or any forms of modality, all the modal facts, if you want. How the modal facts, therefore, can be reduced to the non-modal. Okay? Contrary to that, I will call in opposition just the non-Humean views, but sometimes they're called governing views, because the idea is that there's some sort of modal structure that is first, metaphysically speaking, that governs I will say more about what that means, but that governs the particular facts, the occurrent non-modal facts, which in turn, I wrote obey here because, the governed should obey the governor, right? So in that language, they're obeying the laws. All right. So, this is very green on this screen. I'm sorry if this is offensive. But the question is then, that was part of the question we started out with, is whether a Humean analysis of laws of nature would be viable in a world that is not fundamentally spatial-temporal. Now, there is the possibility, but maybe not the necessity, that space-time in those worlds is emergent. So it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. All right. So I will look at one particular Humean approach. Of course, there's also different versions of Humean approaches, and I think it's going to be important in that kind of investigation or study that we're performing here to actually differentiate between them. The one particular version of Humeanism I'm interested in, and we were interested in that paper, is the Lewisian form, so it's probably more appropriately called Lewisianism rather than Humeanism, because the failure of Lewisianism does, of course, not imply the failure of any form of Humeanism. Okay, anyway, but the idea here is that we reduce modality, including laws, to some fundamental and completely non-modal base. So that means the program is a two-step program. At the first step, we specify the base, what is fundamental, and in the second step, we then show how the modal facts reduce to that base. That's the job of a Lewisian, and in some way or other, of any Humean, I think. So that's not very specifically Lewisian at that point. Okay, so how do we deal with the two steps? Now, this is the very famous quote that you've seen probably at least in one other, yes, by Daniel's presentation in this workshop, but you're all familiar with that. It's the idea of Lewis of Humean supervenience, which is both addressing both steps to some extent anyway. The first step of there being a Humean mosaic, namely a vast mosaic of local matters of particular non-modal facts, and then sort of an arrangement, the mosaic of these qualities, and then anything else supervenes on that. Supervenience is probably too weak a relation, of course, for that second step. What you do is you then bring to bear the machinery of the best systems. That's supposed to be doing performing the second step. So the first step is the Humean mosaic, and the second step is the supervenience or reduction, actually more fully the reduction than just the supervenience. Okay. All right. So that's the main idea. Now, when we talked about quantum gravity, and also in another paper I've written earlier, there is an evident problem with Humean supervenience that I don't need to spend much time to explain. But it's clear that for Lewis, this space arrangement, this mosaic, is clearly spatio-temporal. It's a spatio-temporal arrangement of perfectly natural properties or somewhat local non-modal facts. Okay? So this conception of laws is going to depend on the existence of space-time, because without it, it seems difficult or impossible indeed to articulate what the base is supposed to be. So that means, in response to quantum gravity, it makes to offer an account which is more general and could deal with a situation in which space-time doesn't exist, or at least not fundamentally exist. We will need to give up this idea of mosaic. It must be replaced by something that can be articulated in non-spatial temporal terms. We called it glue. That means you need something that glues together whatever your fundamental non-modal facts are to a world, to one unity in some sense, to the whole base. You need some way of distinguishing of what's part of that base and what is not part of the base. You need a world-making relation. You need something that binds together these things, that unifies them and isolates them from other ways the world could be. Whatever that relation is. For Lewis, it's spatio-temporal or analogously spatio-temporal relations who do that job. But if those are not available, then you need to come up with some other basis. So the question is now, what kind of glue could we find? What kind of relation could we find to do that job, keeping in mind that these relations should not come with any nomic voltage, as it were, so that they should not imply a modality, because the base is supposed to be non-modal. It's hard to see how a Humean project could succeed if the base already is thoroughly modal. I mean, that's the point of the approach. You have a non-modal base. So glue, but no nomic voltage. And in the paper, we argued that this demand puts a Lewisian, anyway, into a sort of tension between the naturalist ambition, which incites you to go and look at fundamental physics to try and identify such a relationship. But given that you're looking at theoretical physics, at fundamental physics, at theories in physics, where these relations can only combine in certain theoretically permissible ways, and that is already charging them modally, because they're not allowed to be combined in any way you want. No completely free recombination. It's a recombination only in accordance to the theories in which you encounter these relations. I mean, that's the sort of the pressure coming in from naturalism. But for Lewisianism, of course, you don't want any necessary connections among the particular facts, no modality in the base. So it's this tension that somehow needs to be navigated by a Humean. So how can we get the glue without also get the nomic voltage? That's the tension we identified. And we discussed one proposal, namely the proposal of using a distinction between kinematics and dynamics to do that job. saying that the kinematics gives us the glue and the dynamics the voltage, the nomic voltage. So that's the idea. Take the kinematically possible models of the theory as metaphysical possibilities. So we get the glue, and the dynamically possible models as nomological possibilities then. That is what will get us the nomic voltage. All right. Now, clearly, this proposal presupposes the distinction, the robust distinction between kinematical and dynamical possibilities. And as we've seen also in the previous talk, that is something that could be challenged. In particular, it's something that Vincent and I argued should not be automatically should not be assumed to automatically hold in the context of quantum gravity. Now, there are different ways, as we've seen, of conceptualizing the distinction between kinematics and dynamics, and maybe some of them could be upheld in the context of quantum gravity, but an overly temporal reading, for instance, of dynamical possibilities is going to run into the obvious problems if there's no time on which to base that. So, at least it's not obvious how to do that. That's not an argument that it cannot be done, of course. So a more thorough investigation of the kind performed by Annika Emilia and Baptiste is certainly called for. It is very naturalistic because where you get it from? Well, from our best physics, presumably. But it may be a little bit too naturalistic because it means, of course, that whatever fundamental theory you take, and now assuming that it makes that distinction between kinematics and dynamics, whatever it considers the kinematical possibilities are now identified with the metaphysical possibilities. Okay? That means anything not in accordance with that theory or that theory's proclaimed kinematic possibilities is not going to be metaphysically possible. That is certainly something Lewis would have wanted to avoid because he had a very permissive notion of metaphysical possibility. This is comparatively restrictive, of course. And it may be insufficiently Humean because we're still saying, we're using the kinematics as to furnish the glue, as I said, but in a way, it may be artificial to sort of say the modal structure is only encoded in the dynamics, but not in the kinematics. In particular, if you think of the kinematics and the dynamics as just giving us a set of constraints, then it's really hard to see why some constraints are supposed to have some modal force and the others do not. So presumably we've already put in quite a bit of modality if we do that, and that means we're not human, even though there are necessary connections in some sense already built in at the beginning. So is this a promising proposal? Maybe not. Another possibility suggested by Rasmus Jaksland and also again taken up in a recent paper by Vincent and Daniele Oriti, we heard about yesterday, is to use something else. Maybe an entanglement relation or transition amplitudes. Or Vincent and Daniele also consider other sort of quantum information theoretic foundation or relations, quantum causal histories, and so on and so forth. So maybe there's a whole sort of, a whole range of relations that could furnish that glue, that could do that job. So that's the idea here. So use such a relation as the world-making relation. Two systems are world-mates if and only if, for instance, they're entangled, or they stand in such a relation. So entanglement replaces spatial-temporal relations as the glue. Now, this is very promising. I like the naturalist attitude of that, of course, but it does require some careful navigation as well for a Humean. In particular, it might be considered, one problem is that this means that any two systems or world maze have to be entangled for there to be for them to be in the same world, as it were. And that makes entanglement not sort of a physically contingent relation that could obtain between two systems, but it makes it a metaphysically necessary relation between them. And that seems very strong and something maybe we do not want to be committed to. Anyway, I mean, there's more things to be considered, and we could now debate the back and forth here. I hope it's clear that the particular Lewisian approach that Lewis proposed is going to be in dire need of revision when we go to a non-spatial temporal setting, and is unlikely to survive that. And there's a couple of moves you can look at as a Humeans here. This is somehow the sort of things you have to explore, I think. Okay. Or one option would, of course, be that you just leave the Humean and you accept that you have to have some sort of modality at the fundamental level. And then one option you could use is to follow Emily Adlam in her constraint approach as she articulated it in this paper which appeared 2 years ago. So I think that there's some connections to the constraint approach by Eddie Chen and Shelley Goldstein, but I'm not going to. I didn't strike it out because I think it's bad. I just struck it out because I wanted to indicate graphically that this is not my topic for today. My topic is Emily's particular approach. All right. So the goal is to give what she calls a realist, I would say a governing account of lawhood, which is much more flexible than existing primitivist approaches or governing approaches. In fact, it should be as flexible as a best systems account, which is relatively flexible because normally we do not say what the best system has to be, other than it has to be explanatorily powerful and simple and having a good trade-off between these things. So it could be used for a wide range of physical theories where we have laws of very different kinds. So the general setup is, another main motivation I take it is that if we think that some kind of structuralism is a good way of approaching or interpreting much of fundamental physics, then this might be sort of a natural combination. So like, okay, sort of ontologically speaking, we have some fundamental structures, and these structures are governed by a modal structure that we add to this. So this is a sort of also is an idea that's been articulated by ontic structural realists like James Ladyman, for instance, but as Adlam argues convincingly in her paper, with not sufficient generality of what that modal structure is supposed to be. So their notion of modal structure doesn't seem to be flying as far as we want it to. So part of the motivation is, of course, to have a sense of a concept of a modal structure that is capable of dealing with the wide range of different kind of laws that we should expect to be seeing in physics. The general setup is actually not unlike the setup in Lewis. We have a base at the first step, an ontology, a Humean mosaic, and then in a second step, for Lewis, we do some sort of best systems account and try to derive the modal structure, the laws, which, however, on Adlam's account, are added, not reduced to, the Humean mosaic, just to sort of contrast the two views and show how they're different and how they're similar. So objective reality for Adlam is then really the package consisting of the Humean mosaic plus some modal structure. All right, so let's start with step 2, inverting the two steps. The step 2, this modal structure, And the point here is that this modal structure can be characterized in terms of constraints, which are ontologically prior to the Humean mosaic, which justifies me in taking it first, before the Humean mosaic. And they help determine the content of the latter, something we have to return to what exactly that means. The constraints are defined not existentially, extensionally, there we go, in the following way. A constraint is defined as the set of all Humean mosaics in which the constraint is satisfied. So this is a laudable approach of trying to avoid any sort of obscure metaphysical definition of what these constraints are, straightforwardly extensional account. So that's certainly to be applauded. Now, these constraints, and this is important, they're objective. They're not somehow subject dependent or some sort of in any way relativized to take away any of their metaphysical relevance. They're objectively there. They're part of reality. Now, I take it, if that's the case, there must be something like a range or a space of Humean mosaics first somehow. That must be there. And this pluriverse, I call it, is going to have to be endowed with some constraint structure, some sort of subset structures, I think. Those constraints, for instance, if a constraint is that it's impossible or the Humean mosaic is constrained such that no motion faster than the speed of light is possible for a physical system or something like that, then that constraint really should be characterized as the set of Humean mosaics in which that's the case, which satisfy that feature. All right. Now, this constraint guarantees, this is a quote, that the actual Humean mosaic belongs then to that corresponding set. So if that constraint is in place, the actual Humean mosaic has to be in that set of Humean mosaics in which nothing is faster than the speed of light, say. Adam says, every possible world in which a given account holds is a possible world in which the Humean mosaic of that world belongs to the associated set. And that leads me to my first challenge. So I have three questions, really, about the approach. There are 3 points where I think I'll formulate them as challenges to anyone in the room to help. But maybe it's a call for developing the approach a little bit more, or at least clarify my confusion. So the first of these challenges is that I'm worried a little bit that this characterization is close to being empty. I give you the fuller quote here to maybe give you a sense of what my concern is. A constraint guarantees that the actual Humean mosaic belongs to the corresponding set. That is to say, so this is my emphasis, but I emphasize it to show that what follows is supposed to be an explanation of the previous one, I think, of the guaranteeing. The guaranteeing, therefore, is cashed out as every possible world in which a given constraint holds is a possible world in which the Humean mosaic, that world belongs to the associated set. And my question is this a characterization of guaranteeing that a Humean mosaic belongs to the corresponding set, or that the actual Humean mosaic belongs to the corresponding set? I mean, I'm going to have to come back to actuality and to how we should think of actuality as well, because that's not entirely clear to me. But, every element of that set is an element of that set. I mean, that's what I mean by bordering on the empty. So what is added by the guarantee? I'm not sure I see what's being added here. In what sense is this a guarantee? So, I mean, that one, honestly, is just a question. I hope to be told what is added, and that's it. And I don't necessarily see a problem. All right, but let's move on. So let's try to see a little bit in more detail how the governing is supposed to be happening. And it's supposed to be happening by metaphysical necessitation. That's the relationship that is being added here. So the constraints, Adlam says, determine the contents of the human mosaic in virtue of metaphysical necessitating, that the actual human mosaic should have certain features. Okay, so a metaphysical necessitation is defined in the following way. X metaphysically necessitates Y just in case every possible world in which X is true is a world in which Y is true. So if a constraint metaphysically necessitates the human mosaic to have certain features to be part of the set, that means in every possible world in which that constraint is a constraint or is true, is a world in which then, I guess, the world is in that set. Now, for me, I've thought about it a little bit, okay, what's the procedure that we follow here? Is it the following? First, we generate a pluriverse of human mosaics. We think in some way about what the possible ways are in which these things could be combined, the fundamental ontology. I mean, this is sort of epistemic procedure, not the metaphysical priority. And then we add a structure of constraints, a subset structure to that space. Some of these constraints are going to actually obtain. I mean, there could be constraints which don't obtain, such as the constraint that no physical object can move with less than the speed of light, or who knows? I mean, there are other conceivable constraints. But we're interested in those which actually obtain. So I'm seeing this as in the pluriverse with all the subset structure. Now, some of them are somehow salient. Some of them are painted in red. It's the actual ones, right? And then these constraints metaphysically necessitate the actual mosaic to be in the intersection of all these constraints, which actually obtain. So the red highlighted salient world, the actual one, must be in this intersection. So, I mean, the intersection of these constraints could contain a single world, potentially, or maybe an infinite number of worlds. That is left open in the picture. The question is, how does actuality work here? Because for Lewis, it's an indexical. So any world is actual for itself, or relative to itself. How are we supposed to be thinking about actuality here? Because it seems to me that it's not indexical, and we shouldn't think of this indexically, which is fine because maybe we don't want to be modal realists like Lewis. Maybe we want to be actualists and say that, no, all of this is just some sort of structure that we have to make sense of how the actual world is governed by laws. Okay, good. So let's think a bit more about laws, ruling out the possibility of probabilistic laws, which is discussed in the paper as well, but I'll leave out for simplicity. A law expresses then the modal fact that the actual human mosaic must have the property corresponding to a particular constraint. So it's expressing a certain modal fact. The laws govern then in the sense of metaphysical necessitation. So rather than reaching into the universe to meddle in the course of physical events, I mean, this is a reference to maybe some picture like Maudlin, sort of where the laws really govern hands-on the instantaneous current state of the universe and force it and to produce its future in a certain way or something like that. So that's not the picture at all. The modal structure associated with the laws can be regarded as simply selecting human mosaics all at once in an external fashion. So it's not this sort of direct, temporally thick notion. And that is exactly consciously done like that because there are a bunch of laws that Adleman identifies at the beginning of her paper that do not fit this picture. And the goal is to have an account which is more general that can deal with these other cases. So lawhood is consistent with a block universe all at once, the history given all together in a way, kind of picture, since the whole mosaic is now the object of the law rather than some sort of slice, temporal slice or something like that. Okay, so this gives us, as she says, a naturalized version of governance. Now, maybe I'll skip, I'll be very brief here because one thing is important, this is not Humeanism in disguise. It is incompatible with Humean supervenience because now we could have, this is an example from John Carroll where we have two worlds in which the particular known modal facts are exactly the same, but the laws are different. And this is something that's always impressed non-Humeans because they think such a thing there should be metaphysically distinct possibilities like that. And on a Lewisian picture, when you have Humean supervenience, that's not possible because that's a failure of supervenience, of course. For Adlam, this is not. Since we don't have Humean supervenience, this is possible. We can have the non-modally identical world with nevertheless different modal structures. Okay, so now moving 5 more minutes of the Humean mosaic. Now here, some problems become acute when we go to the non-spatial temporal context, sort of quantum gravitational context, where space-time may be emergent. And I'm trying to illustrate that. So Adlam says the Humean mosaic consists of instantiations of categorical properties in various regions across spacetimes, including possibly facts about the geometry of spacetime itself. So that's a very Lewisian picture of the mosaic. I don't think it's any different from that. So we use the phrase Humean mosaic to refer to all of the actual non-modal content of reality. But in addition, of course, to that mosaic, we're committed to the existence of the modal structures that are distinct from this mosaic. And then a few pages later, so that's the beginning of the characterization of the account, and now we're 6 pages into that, getting to the end, more or less, of the presentation of the account, where she says any fundamental ontology must ultimately give rise to some distribution of categorical properties across space-time, and these are now my emphases, even if these properties and/or space-time are regarded as emergent features. So the approach is supposed to be also accommodating the situation we're interested in. And this distribution of properties across space-time is the level at which we as observers make contact with objective reality. So it is the appropriate level at which to describe the modal features of law, the emergent level, if necessary. So this implies that the framework of constraints is adopted at the level of the possibly emergent spatial temporal distribution of properties, and that's the case we're interested in. And she seems to think that this means now that the laws will be governing, so there will be a modal structure at the emergent level, but there are also laws governing the fundamental level. Governing this fundamental non-spatial temporal substratum, whatever it is, this fundamental non-spatial temporal structure. And here's the evidence that there must be laws at that level as well. Laws governing this, I added this non-spatial temporal, that's not in the quote, but I think that's what's intended. This substratum will have consequences for the geometry of space-time and the distribution of properties across it. So it should give rise to that in one way or another, and the laws should. And therefore, these laws will still give rise to meaningful constraints within the constraint framework. And on the next page, the role of the Humean mosaic in the constraint framework is simply to capture the actual non-modal contents of reality in order that we can identify sets consisting of different ways the non-modal contents of reality could be. And that leads me to issue a further challenge here, or maybe invitation to elaborate. if the actual non-modal contents of reality sits at the emergent level, because that's where the human mosaic sits, then it seems like the substratum is not part of that contents. As it identifies the modal structure at the emergent level, it seems as if the constraint approach doesn't have the resources to characterize the fundamental laws. So what are these laws, which are there, but they're not captured by the modal structure, which is at the emergent level? Now, in the paper with Vincent, we considered, relatively briefly, but we considered the possibility that since space-time is contingent in quantum gravity, or I mean, that's the assumption anyway, maybe it'll turn out to be false, but under the assumption that an analysis of laws at this emergent level would imply that there are no laws in such cases where there is no emergent space-time, where it contingently does not exist, unless we offer an analysis at the fundamental level, the level of quantum gravity. Okay? And there may be other problems related to that. So this is an insistence that we should have an account of laws of nature which can deal with the fundamental laws and sort of capture that at the fundamental level. So here it seems as if the account therefore runs into the problem. That it does so is maybe not surprising, since the replacement with step 2, so it's rather than the best system, we have a modal structure that is being added, but the step 1, the human mosaic, is kept. And as Vincent and I pointed out in our paper, we think in the context of quantum gravity in particular, the main problems are with level 1, or step 1, I should say, rather than step 2. All right. One more challenge and then I'll wrap up. Now, everybody who defends a particular account of laws does so because they think there's some particular attractive benefit to their approach that maybe others do not have. So Humeans, for instance, say that, well, the nice thing for us is we do not, I mean, if we succeed anyway in the program, we do not have to assume that there is fundamental modality. There's a reduction of the modal to the non-modal. That is what is attractive about our research program. If we succeed, this would be big news. This would be a significant accomplishment. The primitivist, or somebody like Tim Maudlin, would say like, well, the point of making the laws productive was that we, as input, just need the present facts, the present state of the world, or maybe of a system we're interested in, plus the laws. That's the only input we need. And that will be enough to produce or generate in some way all the non-present facts at that world. I mean, maybe we need to negotiate how exactly we should think about probabilistic laws, and it's not going to be trivial. Everybody has their challenges, right? But that picture is supposed to be attractive for that reason. And moreover, of course, Maudlin thinks this captures what much of physics does. Now, of course, there's problems there as well, as Emily has shown. You know, it does not capture all there is in physics, and that's a significant problem. This dispositional approach, for instance, or the powers approach, they will say that like the attractive thing is, sorry for the typo, is that we reduce laws to dispositions, and it's these dispositions or powers which are present in the world, which then also have something like a role of producing or of generating the non-present content of the world. So there's all these different sales points for all the different approaches. And it's clear that Adlam's approach doesn't claim any of these sales points. There's no reduction. There's no attempted sense of production of the non-present by the present or something like that. The question is, what's the attraction? I think the attraction is clearly that it's obviously capable of dealing with a much wider range of situations which are relevant in physics. I didn't write it here, but I absolutely think that's the case. But apart from that, if we're impressed by that argument, why not go Humean rather than, maybe that's the main question, here. If the choice comes down to a sort of a Humean approach and a constraint approach, why should we go constraint rather than Humean? Why should we assume there to be the modal structure? One reason, of course, one could give is to say that we don't think that the Humean reduction succeeds. If it doesn't, then that would be a pretty final or conclusive reason for us to reject Humeanism. All right, conclusions. Last slide. So the tentative result that space-time disappears at the fundamental level would have borne out, I think, force rather radical reconceptions of accounts to laws of nature and maybe to modality more generally. Lewisianism will need to be revised, or Humeanism needs to be revised fairly radically to accommodate this possibility, I think. Adam's constraint account is built as a more flexible framework, but encounters, to remind you, the three following, again I say challenges, maybe it's just questions for elaboration. First, what do constraints guarantee? Is it just extensionally, or how should we think about this? What's added by this guarantee? That was the question. The first one. The second one, how can we deal with fundamental laws, which is something I think is particularly important in the context of quantum gravity. And secondly, how should we think of the benefits of the approach, in particular vis-a-vis the Humean approach? Thank you very much.
So we have less than 15 minutes for questions.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's great to see you engaging with this great approach. I guess I just quickly give us an idea of how I might respond to those three constraints. With regard to the first one, we were worried that the guarantee was empty in some sense. I think it's not empty because if you imagine assigning to every possible world a set of constraints and a Humean mosaic, there's nothing there to ensure that the Humean mosaic is going to be in the sets corresponding to the constraints you assign. So the guarantee is just there to say the Humean mosaic has to be in the one corresponding to those constraints.
Okay, so that's at the beginning of how you produce your world or generate your worlds, to say that there's a mosaic and a modal structure, and there has to be a fit.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
okay, I see. Okay, that is about mission. Yes, I see that. Okay.
How does the guarantee work? Yeah, the big one. There's some sense of that. With regard to the gravity case, and I agree that as formulation, this doesn't really deal well with the gravity case. The main goal was to be as good as the Humean approach, so it sort of stands to reason that it's not going to fail in the same kinds of cases. I think, roughly speaking, you asked about the substratum. I would be inclined to think the substratum is going to be modal in nature, so it's not technically going to be part of the actual non-modal content of reality. How to sort of knit that together into a consistent constraint approach is obviously not perhaps obvious. With regard to benefits, I think that the main selling point is the constraint approach is designed for people who want the flexibility of the Humean approach, but who have intuitions favoring governance style approaches. So if you think Humean approaches are not sufficiently explanatory, or that they have problems with induction, or the various reasons people get in favor of governance. So that the selling point is just flexibility plus governance, I would say.
Okay, thank you. That's very, very helpful. Great. Right, so I think maybe in particular the second question, challenge B here, is an invitation to then develop it a little bit further and see whether we can maybe come up with a conception of the Humean mosaic or the fundamental, the substratum structure that fits the overall spirit of the constraint approach, but can deal with the quantum gravitational case as well. Yeah, okay, good, great.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I'd like to think about more.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, so we have Nils. Oh,
Wondering how much as a naturalist you can draw this distinction between one hand this kind of world-making relationship approach, and on the other hand this kind of theoretical and dynamical distinction approach. The thing is, on a theoretical reading, theoretical distinction is only the realization that you need some kind of setup, some kind of stage, relative to which you formulate a neurodynamics or something else. And the setup shouldn't be theory-free, it shouldn't be free of any kind of context. But if you now talk about integral relations, for instance, right, you cannot think of these things as something theory-free either, right? You have to now define them in some kind of what you would think, kind of space. And so I was wondering how much of a difference can you make between like a naturalist approach to world-making relations as opposed to having some kinematics first and dynamics afterwards.
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think it's clear that in either of the two proposals I discussed, they're very naturalistic, and it's hard to see how they could avoid any modal implications at all in the very base of the human mosaic. So the entanglement approach, or anything like that, of the kinds discussed by Daniele and Vincent in their paper, is going to lead into some of the same problems, in the sense that this will be theoretically loaded, and therefore with nomic voltage, as I say, metaphorically. So, but that you look as if I haven't answered your question. So.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what's so much different between having a liberal conception of the kinetic dynamical distinction on the one hand, and some kind of idea of that there needs to be a world-making relationship, what have you. And for me, this talk of there needs to be a world-making relationship is basically a talk of there needs to be some kind of stage setting as well, right? So what is really the difference between these two?
No, it's not different. I mean, the kinematic dynamic approach is supposed to be one way of performing that stage setting thing first, the world making, generating the pluriverse or something like that. That's what it's supposed to be doing, as I understand it.
Sure, but then I would just think the theory first context, how would not even this world-making talk be a subset of the kinetic dynamical distinction talk? Okay, maybe I made this as a representing it, but I thought B and A were kind of different options. To me, B seems like a subcase of A, but yeah.
Oh, well, okay, possibly, depending on how you think about exactly how you want to fill in the details for both proposals, I think. They may turn out to be a subset of one another. Okay.
For the naturalist, I don't say for everyone, but I mean, if you think of world making as happening in the context of physical theories as we normally practice them, then I would say B is a subset of A.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It didn't. The proposal wasn't meant to commit to the negation of that in any way.
Yeah.
So it's possible that, depending on how exactly you work out the details, one of them may just be a version of the other. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, they both, don't avoid the tension I mentioned, I think. I think it's extremely hard, though, how that tension could be avoided. If you take naturalism seriously, you're gonna run into some version of that tension, and I mean, there's a very general sense in which the sort of Lewisian program, however you proceed to fill in the details, if you first generate the pluriverse of all the possible worlds, you must make some assumptions. You must have some basis, some kind of relations, of some kind of glue some kind of way of identifying, unifying, and isolating these worlds that either presupposes some kind of theory in some sense. Maybe it's a sophisticated physical theory, maybe it's just sort of a very pedestrian theory of basic metaphysical intuitions, or whatever it is, but some theory is going to go into that anyway, and by that fact alone, you are going to exclude some things as possibilities on whatever basis. And the question is whether, what does it really take to implement a Humean idea of no necessary connections, of implementing something that really deserves to be called free recombination? How are you going to do that? How are you really going to weed out any modality in any way of articulating the Humean mosaic? Yeah. And maybe if you think this through, the conclusion is going to be that a strict division between the Humean mosaic and the modal structure is not going to be possible. Maybe it's just going to have to come in some kind of package anyway, which I think wouldn't be a problem, a deep problem for the constraint approach, but maybe a deep problem for the Humean.
So we have another follow-up, right?
Yeah, just a clarification. When you were discussing Andrew's work, and you were pointing out the issues with, in the case of space-time is emergent. Just to understand, our laws understood in a context in which we distinguish emergent and fundamental properties and theories. Are the accounts flexible enough to allow us to talk of fundamental laws versus emergent laws, or there is some implicit assumption or requirement for fundamentality in what we call a law?
So the way I've been thinking about this is that the physics gives us relations of relative fundamentality without thinking about what it is to be a law of nature or anything like that. Just look at the physics. There's a relationship between general relativity and the putative theory of quantum gravity, such that the quantum gravitational theory is going to be more fundamental by virtue of its being more general and so on and so forth. So that structures the relationship between theories. Now, there's a sense in which for each of these different levels of theories, we have laws. Naively thinking now first, without thinking in terms of a particular account, we have the laws of general relativity, or sort of that modal structure as postulated by general relativity. We will have presumably something like laws of quantum gravity, or the modal structure as postulated by the particular theory of quantum gravity, and so on and so forth. Now, as a philosopher, I come to this situation and say, I would like to develop an account of laws of nature, that or modal structure or something like that, that can capture the different levels, whatever we mean by law. What do we mean at law? Presumably we mean something similar when we talk about quantum gravitational laws compared to what we mean by general relativistic laws. The lawhood aspect of these things is going to be the same. That's what I'm interested in. And now, of course, a very straightforward check on my account is going to be, well, does it capture the laws at the fundamental level as well as at the emergent level? Something like that. That's supposed to be the project. And the problem B here is it's pretty, I think, clear what's supposed to be happening at the emergent level in case space-time is emergent, because we know how to do or have some idea of how to do the Humean mosaic, and then constraints can be implemented in a quite wide variety of laws that may be operating at that level. But the question is now, what about the fundamental level? There need to be some laws or some modal structure, as I think we agreed. So our approach should capture these things as well. And the challenge here, the question is, does it? As stated, I don't think it's quite there yet, but you know, we will work for a future project to develop such an account. That was the challenge B.
Can I add a follow-up question? So my thought is, no, it's independent from the quantum gravity context. In a situation in which you have molecular dynamics and Navier-Stokes, it seems to me that if we want to talk about laws in both settings, and we would have an issue if we also want to maintain that laws are somehow part of the ontological structure of the world. And this difficulty could only be resolved if you also admit that some sort of multi-level ontology, that we can sensibly talk of an ontology of the molecular dynamics, an ontology of the hydrodynamic level. But obviously you're deflating a bit this strength of the ontological structures you're positive.
You can kind of find there as long as the higher level laws follow from the lower level laws. You could say in some sense the lower level laws are the ones that are like really fundamentally part of the ontology, but anything that's sort of derivable from the ontology is still in some sense ontological.
So you would say that Navier-Stokes, if the world is made of molecules, Navier-Stokes would be ontologically there, even if it is.
I think if the lower levels are ontologically there, then in some sense any consequence of them is also part of the structure of that world.
That's right, and that's, I think, the analogous situation in quantum gravity. If, you know, it turns out as we expect, there will be a fundamental level of whatever exactly it is, these structures that quantum gravity postulates with the quantum gravitational laws, those will be there, really. I mean, unless we go even more fundamental. And then the challenge, the scientific challenge also, is then to understand why it is that general relativistic laws and general relativistic ontologies of like relativistic spacetimes was as successful a description of phenomena in the world as it was. And so we need to show how those laws from GR and the ontology of GR somehow can be related to the fundamental ontology in a way that explains why they were such a good approximation. That doesn't make them true, fully, completely. That's not how reality works. We've understood it works differently. But we've understood now, hopefully, why GR was so successful. And the ontology, the fundamental ontology, what exactly it is, behaves in ways which is sufficiently similar to relativistic spacetimes to explain why we thought the world is made of relativistic spacetimes at some time. And the same with the hydrodynamic case. So really, it's not hydrodynamic, the ontology is not there. Really, the laws are a little bit different than Navier-Stokes, but we've understood, presumably if we've done our scientific tasks, our homework, we've understood why Navier-Stokes is an extremely good approximation under such and such conditions, and why the molecular, whatever fundamental ontology behaves as if it's a fluid, a continuum fluid. Yeah, maybe we should continue over lunch.
Yeah, in principle we have 2 more questions, but it's
Okay.
already 12, so
So
we go
go
again.
for
You can do it? So,
no, we
No, no.
can stop.
okay.